Finally, we did it. We found the counter subject after all that. Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers interested in composition. In today's episode of How the French Learned Fugue, I'm going to show you how to find the counter subject. So the first thing we've got to do is we got to figure out the response. Now, we covered a lot of this in the first episode of How the French Learned Fugue. We see F going to E, which in C major is scale degree 4 to scale degree 3, which is another dominant tonic relationship. So it is starting in F major and ending in C major. Now we need to figure out if there's a mutation. And don't forget, in the Baroque style, when you have a subject or the response, it's either going to start on the tonic or the dominant. So if we were to have transposed that response back to the central key, to F major, we would get this. So this is incorrect because when we put the scale degrees, which I highly recommend, we see we start on the 4th scale degree. So in the language of the language of the time, that is just not going to happen. So what that means is that there was a mutation. In that case, what we need to do for the subject is to modify or restore it to the original version. So instead of starting with an opening 5th, which would be scale degree 4 to scale degree 1, we're going to put it what is much more natural and obvious would be 5 to 1. Okay, so an opening 4th. Okay, now we're going to decide the order of the entrances, and this is actually a very important step. In a fugue, we have this principle called adjacent voicing. You're going to have the subject going to enter in one voice, and then it's going to enter in the voice just above or the voice just below. So in this particular case, I recommend just working backwards. So we see that we have the response in the bass. And so then I need the subject. Okay, remember we took out that mutation. And so then in the tenor, it's going to fall here. And then we need the response. So we put it up in the next register. Now the question is the response going to have a mutation or not? First, I put it with the mutation. And then I put it without the mutation. Almost always, especially for a study like this, you're going to be consistent and you'll have the mutation. But you will see in Bach, he doesn't always have the mutation for the response, though usually in the exposition, when he's bringing out the entrances, if there's going to be mutation, it will stay consistent every single time. Of course, we have the starting entrance, which will be in the soprano in this register. So now what we need to do is we need to test out the entrances, put them in the actual music to see how they fit. Okay, so we have the first entrance, and then we have to fit in the second entrance. Sometimes there's going to be a little bit space in between the first and second entrance. Other times they're going to align perfectly. Now here we have an example from Bach. Okay, so you'll notice that after the subject enters, there's a little bit of filler before the next entrance comes in. And then in order to get into the third entrance, he goes through a sequence. So that is something you have to figure out in these exercises. Are the subject response coming consecutively, or is there some kind of filler? Well, as you can see, I figured out that there's no real filler. They're kind of moving forward. I think this is actually kind of common in exercises like this because if you were actually applying to the Paris Conservatory, you don't have all day. You might have it's called mise en loge. You might have 8 hours, maybe 6 hours to do the exam. If the fugue is too long, it's just they can't actually verify people can do fugue. Okay, here I want to show you exactly why we have mutations. So notice coming out of the subject in the soprano, it's kind of strange harmonically because we have an F in the soprano and the alto ends on G. Now, it is possible to change harmony by the eighth notes, but that has to be consistent in the harmonic logic of the piece. So in this particular case, most likely the harmony is changing every quarter note, so we have to modify the alto entrance with a mutation. Likewise, later on, after the third entrance in the tenor, when the bass comes in, or if you're thinking of a string quartet, when the cello comes in, if we do not do a mutation, then we're going to have a confused sense of harmony. Now I want to briefly show you how the French notate fugues. So you'll see we have the soprano clef, we have the alto clef, we have the tenor clef, and then of course we know the bass. So the advantage of this is that you're going to think in terms of the roles of those voices. Also, it can really help you to see if you're within range. But one of the disadvantages is that it's just more difficult because most of us, we're just not fluent with these clefs. French fugue kind of thinking process, since it's so new to a lot of us from an English-speaking audience, I'm trying to keep it rather simple for now. Now what we're going to do is we're going to very quickly just harmonize the subject and the response. What we're going to need to do is we're going to have to look for the counter subject, right? Because in the French style, all that you need is provided in the bastonnet, in the completed exercise. So the counter subject has to be somewhere there, but to aid us, I have done a quick harmonic analysis to give me an idea. So therefore, when I'm going to be looking for the counter subject in other keys, I'm going to be looking for some kind of leading tone to tonic in the bass on those beats. So going from beat 3 into beat 1. First off, we're looking in the new key. We went over this in episode 1, but we're in G minor. Just as a refresher for everyone, we see lots of G and B flat. We see prolonged duration on the D, which is the dominant, and we have a perfect authentic cadence in G minor. Now we need to transpose the subject to G minor because we're going to have to test it with the bass. So that is what the subject is going to be in G minor. Just bite the pride and write it out because I guarantee you our brains are so fuzzy these days. So now we got to test out that subject against the bass line, okay, in the hopes to find where is the counter subject in the bass. So in this example, these do not work juxtaposed together. Now it starts off fine, right? Because with the Re, Sol, Re, the D, G, D, that fits perfectly with the other notes in the bass. But then when we have that E flat against the D, that is an unprepared dissonance. It is very aggressive. It's very, very stark. It's just not stylistic for the Baroque period, even the classical period. Now, if you are composing a fugue in your own style, that is totally fine, right? The hardest part of actually composing a fugue in your own style is listening for your authentic voice, because if you do too much of this study, or if you don't know how to break free from the chains, you're just going to be doing quasi-Bach, and I've seen a lot of composers fall into this trap, and it's one of those things, it may fill up your ego, it may fill up garner some envy from other composers, but it's just not something we can program on a concert. All right, so it didn't work in the first measure of the G minor, but what about the second measure? So we have a match, okay? It works nicely. We'll have to figure out the harmony. I have some questions about how harmonize certain beats, but it sounds like a match. However, if we look at the actual bass, it is not suitable for a counter subject. Notice that we have the leap of an octave, and we have a 5-5-1, so it's clearly a dominant to tonic relationship. It may in fact be a perfect authentic cadence. Now, obviously right now we're testing with the treble clef, but this may come in a different voice. But because the bass line is doing something clearly harmonic, it is not appropriate for a counter subject, because the counter subject has to be a lot more flexible because it'll need to come in the inner voices. Also, if you're going to have the leap of an octave, it's very difficult to make that work in an inner voice. But we did find a moment where the subject works perfectly with the bass. So even though this wasn't what we were looking for, we're probably gonna make a note. I recommend put it to the side that you have found something that you will need later on. Now I want to just quickly do a harmonic analysis because I want to prepare for the future. Okay. Now sometimes you got to be careful. If you're on a task, you don't want to do side tasks because then you could get distracted. But here I just did a brief harmonic analysis. I have a 5 in G minor. Not too sure about these chords. I have some ideas, but I see it does work. It's possible. And then we end with a dominant 7. Let's search in the next key. So here I know it's D minor for a couple of reasons. One, I have an A for a rather prolonged duration in a short exercise like this. A going to G, which is probably a 5, and then the 4th scale degree, which is the 7th of the dominant 7. Actually 5, 4, 3, right? We get to the F, which would be the 3rd of the D minor chord. We see a D minor chord on this beat too, F to D. And we also see a perfect authentic cadence at the end. We have E, A, D, so 2, 5, 1. I think it's very safe to say that we're in D minor. So we test, and of course we have transposed it to D minor. Doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Well, notice that we have that clash. We get to the dominant with the A and then the B flat and G. Way too dissonant. All right, so notice that sounds good. Okay, that matches. So we have found the subject. Okay, now we're looking for the counter subject in the bass. Where is it? But we have found a moment where the subject lines up. So we got additional information. Now, when I look at the content of the bass part to determine if it is a counter subject, it is not a counter subject because notice how we have a 2, 5, 1. Okay, like I mentioned, it's a perfect authentic cadence and it is super harmonic in nature. And that's only appropriate, first of all, for a bass, but at the end of a section. So it's not going to work every time for the counter subject. So we got a small win, but we still haven't secured the big win. I want to briefly touch upon the sequence. So the sequence is not an ideal moment for the counter subject. Okay, they usually come in the divertissement, as we call it in French, which is a moment or a time where we have some relief because it can feel a bit oppressive to constantly have subject response. Okay, so we need some relief, though it can't be totally different from what was happening before. Note here that we're changing keys. Okay, it seems like maybe we start in A minor, then I see the F sharp going to that B flat, which is the 3rd of a G minor chord. So maybe we're in G minor, not sure. Notice that we end up on a C, which is the dominant in F major. So it doesn't make sense to have look for a counter subject here because there's just too many moving parts. Also remember that for a sequence, the goal is usually to move us to another key or to kind of buy some time within the same key. But it's a moment, most importantly, where the subject and its counter subject would presumably be absent. So just prior to that sequence, I see a new key. I can see right away it's A minor because we have a G sharp to A. Also notice prior we have an A tied over going to a G sharp. So I'm thinking automatically some kind of suspension. We have a B natural. Also we have an A minor chord, just clearly some kind of arpeggio, quasi arpeggio at the end. So we're in A minor. Let's see how it juxtaposes itself against the bass. Finally, we did it. We found the counter subject. After all that suffering, we did it. We found the counter subject. Okay, let's just verify, let's make sure, but it feels too good to not be the counter subject. Notice the contrasting roles of the subject, or actually, this is technically the response and the counter subject. The response has 16th notes, and at the same time, the counter subject is doing kind of an opposing rhythm. Has these suspensions, as I had predicted. Notice at the end, when the counter subject is doing 16th notes, the subject/response is not doing continuous 16th notes. So we see a contrasting roles, okay? And that's a good confirmation that we have the counter subject versus prior, where we had really stark harmonic function roles, like for, clear cadential role. It's just not going to work. I highly recommend, if you want to pursue this as a means to getting ready for fugue, that you do two things. One, that you ensure that you have a strong level in harmony. The other thing that I recommend you do is that you try composing a fugue in your own style right now.